Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 19 today with the second of the stories of people from the house of Saul or the house of Benjamin, or perhaps even the wider circle of Israel, coming to David in the liminal moment as he is surrounded by all the elders and other people of Judah to cross the Jordan and return to Jerusalem as king. And we saw last time, as you can see on the right side of the screen, if I go back up, the plea of Shammai, who had previously cursed David, and Abishai's questioning about whether he deserves death. But David says, in very ambiguous language, no one shall be put to death this day in Israel. But that doesn't mean, as we looked at last time, that he won't tell Solomon on David's deathbed to take care of Shammai. So now we see Mephibosheth, and similarly, this story, like we saw last time with Shammai, has a background and a sequence, and that's what we can see here, and we'll look at that in some detail in just a moment. But before we do, I'd like to focus on a couple elements of where we are in the story. You can see that our immediate story forms a nice little chiasm here, framed by the in shalom at the beginning and the end, and then the king speaking to Mephibosheth, and the king speaking to Mephibosheth again, and then his response in the middle. And that'll form a chiasm paired not with the previous one, which is not chiastic, as you can see there, but with the next one with David's friend Barzillai the Gileadite, who discusses whether he will come to Jerusalem with him or not. Another aspect of what I want to look at here is, since these are both stories, this is the story today and the previous one about Saulides, one of the issues that's at stake here, and it's amazing to me how so many really good scholars take the story at face value rather than questioning what I'm inviting you to question right now, is why should we trust Mephibosheth's version of the story? David does, just like he previously accepted Ziba's version of the story with no question. And I'd like to suggest that one of the things that's going on in this passage is, at least implicitly, is raising for the reader, can we really trust David's judgment? We've seen before, and we'll see it again today, as you can see on the right side. Mephibosheth says to him, do whatever seems good in your eyes. And we saw earlier that that was a question of he was doing good in his eyes. But is what's good in David's eyes the same as what Yahweh sees? Or is it good for the people of Israel or the people of Judah? We note that earlier, David fell for the story that Nathan told him about the rich man, the poor man, the ewe lamb, and the traveler. And then he fell for the story that the wise woman of Tekoa told him about the two sons. So what we've actually seen so far is David is credible. He believes that both those stories, both of which we know are complete fabrications, as if they were literally true. And so far, as we'll see in the sequence, which I can put up here, he believes whoever is speaking to him and doesn't question them. And even though as readers, we might suspect, wait a minute, something's going on. I don't think it's just that I happen to be a lawyer in my previous life that it makes me suspicious. You'd think that the king, who has every reason to think that people would lie to him in order to get benefit for themselves, would at least investigate a little bit, although he's in no position to investigate while he's standing at the Jordan. Why not just wait till he gets back to Jerusalem to make the decision? There seems to be nothing urgent there. And there's also something very suspicious in the story that David can see but we can't, which is how did Mephibosheth, who notes again that he's lame and that the issue was that a donkey had to be saddled for him and it didn't happen. Well, how did he get where he is? We don't hear anything about that. So somehow he got there even without Ziba's help. So I'd like to suggest that this is suspicious as we enter this, and you have to decide for yourself whether David is doing something kind, which some scholars see, or correcting a previous injustice, which some other scholars see, or simply falling for the latest message that comes to him. And in the end, what he decides to divide it in half, well, some scholars treat that as Solomon-like. Well, it's not like Solomon, because in the Solomon story in 1 Kings 3, it's about dividing a baby in half, which obviously can't happen. But whereas here, land could certainly be divided in half. But is dividing it in half really what's just and fair, given the various testimonies? We'll have to decide that for ourselves. So as we prepare to enter into our immediate passage, let's take a quick look through the sequence as we did with the Shammai story in the last video, so we can see what the narrative context is in which our story arises, and the point that I was just making about whether David is simply listening to the last thing he heard. So we see way back in chapter 4, Mephibosheth is not mentioned in 1 Samuel at all, so we just see it starting here in 2 Samuel. We just hear the sheer fact that Saul had a grandson, Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, who was lame in the feet. And so that's the first thing we hear. Then we hear a few chapters later in chapter 9, David summons him, and David makes an offer to give all that belonged to Saul and to his house to your master's grandson, spoken to Ziba, Mephibosheth's servant. And so, simply arbitrarily, it seems, he gives it all to Mephibosheth. But as we looked at the time, the key was, you shall eat at my table always. And the narrator affirms it here at the end, which, as the end of 2 Kings has to the king of Jerusalem in relation to the king of Babylon, that's indicating captivity to somebody else. And so, David having Mephibosheth eat at his table could be perceived as generous, as some commentators do. It also means keeping your enemies close. And since Mephibosheth is lame, he doesn't seem like he could do much sitting at the table in Jerusalem where you can keep an eye on him. And we heard nothing about him during the whole Absalom rebellion. So, as you can see here, from 9 to 16, we saw Ziba come down there and give this statement, but we didn't hear from Mephibosheth directly. So when David is escaping from Absalom, Ziba comes to him and with a whole package of goodies here, and then David asks, where's your master's son? And Ziba tells him this: he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom. Is that true? We have no idea whether that's true or not. It doesn't take much to understand that Ziba had reason to defame Mephibosheth, because maybe he would get the land. After all, as we saw, Ziba has 15 sons and 20 servants, and so he's got a whole entourage to take care of, and the land would certainly be handy for him. We know nothing about Ziba's economics otherwise. But King David, with no questioning and no suspicion at all, simply decides all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. Takes completely Ziba's word that Mephibosheth is a traitor. It's interesting that given that, they didn't order Mephibosheth killed, but this is what he does. So now we get to our immediate scene, and Mephibosheth says, I was deceived, and David simply responds to that. And we really have to question, how do we know that what Mephibosheth is saying here is true? He has every reason to be saying what he's saying here, given that he may well know what Ziba said, or he may have heard about that, although we don't know about that, and may wanting to get back at Ziba. We've heard that Ziba is here. We heard that in the previous passage, as you can see here on the right side of the screen, that just as Shammai came down, we heard that little parenthetical, and Ziba came down as well. But what we didn't hear is any response from that. So we don't know where Ziba is in relation to Mephibosheth and David in this scene, but wherever he is, he's not heard from. You'd think that if David knew he was there or had seen he was there, as we readers do, he would have said, well, Ziba, what do you have to say to this? But that's not what happens. There's also a footnote to the story way later in chapter 21, when after a dispute, the Gibeonites said, it's not a matter of silver or gold between us and the house of Saul, nor for us to put anyone to death. And David said, what do you say that I should do for you? And they demand that all the sons of Saul be killed. But the king spared Mephibosheth and turned over all the other grandchildren of Saul to be killed. So is that, again, mercy on Mephibosheth, or is that because he's Jonathan's son, and David is trying to walk the line between risking a Saulide opponent and protecting the son of his best friend Jonathan? But no intentions are given, and therefore we have to decide this as readers. It's, as I've been saying throughout all the Hebrew Bible videos here in Radical Bible, it's one of the beautiful and fascinating things of the Hebrew Bible is that the language and the narrative style makes these stories very ambiguous, and we as readers have to decide motivations. So with that context, let's jump right into our story. So we are told right at the beginning, Mephibosheth, grandson of Saul, so highlighting the Saulide element, came down to call on the king. As I've been highlighting, the word translated in New RC as meet is always call on, so we see all the sequences of calling on the king. And there are also some verbal things here, and we have to interpret the appearance he's making. So the New RSV renders it in smoother English than the Hebrew is, but as I've been trying to do, render it more literally. He had not made his feet or made his mustache. It's literally one verb used twice. So he had not made his feet or his mustache or washed his clothes. The word here for beard is the word for mustache. The word for beard is zaken, and this is not the word for beard. It's the word for mustache, as it is these other times. So why the New RSV translates that directly wrong, it's hard to know. We know his feet are lame, so what does this mean? He had not made his feet, or if we want to take the NORSV's euphemistic version, taken care of. We don't know whether it means he didn't wash them, or all we know is they're lame, but we don't know what the condition is. Or washed his clothes. Is this because he's feeble? We note that the narrator adds, from the day the king left until the day he came back in Shalom. So on the surface of it, it appears to be in solidarity with the king. that since David is gone, Mephibosheth is engaging in this ritual. It doesn't say he's fasting, but this ritual of mourning and perhaps a sense of personal sacrifice until he finds out about David. Is it real or is it a pose? How can we know? We can't possibly know. And David doesn't know, and David doesn't ask. So the story continues here. When he came from Jerusalem, and as my note below is, underscoring his effort to meet David before the king's return home, although it's unclear how he got there given the deception he claims. He came from Jerusalem to call on the king says to him. And notice how the scene is presented as if it's just one-on-one between them. But we've already seen that Ziba is there with his 35 people, and Shammai came down with 1,000 Benjaminites, and all the Judahites are here. So it's a one-on-one conversation amidst a big crowd. And so David says to him directly, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" And he answered, and as my note from Falkelman has below, is an impressive plea in which Mephibosheth vindicates himself magnificently and at the same time earns admiration for his ability to put himself, which in such a dangerous position, into another's hands, for his devotion and for his dignity. And Falkelman is one of the commentators who really sees Mephibosheth as a person of integrity and dignity here, and that's one way to read it, but it's not the only way to read it. And my note continues that Falkelman has in a footnote, he dismisses interpretations and see the speech as, quote, flattery or ambiguity require no further discussion. Why do they require no further discussion? That's exactly a discussion I'm urging on us here, because it is ambiguous, and we don't know his intention, and we don't even know whether it's true that he's done this all along, although we can take the narrator's word for it perhaps more solidly. So then he says, "My lord, O king, my servant," plainly Ziba being referred to here, "deceived me." A word we've heard a couple of times previously in the book of Samuel. For your servant, speaking of himself there, it's ambiguous whether he's talking about himself or referring to one of the king's people, but plainly in the context we can see that he's speaking about himself. So Mephibosheth says to David that he'd claimed to say to Ziba earlier, "Saddle a donkey for me so I may ride on it and go with the king. For your servant is lame." Plainly, your servant is lame was not being said to Ziba, who knows that, but David knows it as well. This is not the first time they've met. As my note below has from Graham Old, what one onlooker might see as necessary support for a disabled man, another would interpret as a royal pretender from a dispossessed house. And all not following Falkelman there is certainly seeing the ambiguity of perception here. So he continues, and notice it's a relatively long speech compared to what David says. David offers just a few words, and the king refers to as multiplying his words. Then he claims this: "He has slandered your servant." As my note has below, literally the verb regal here means to trip up, but it also is used to spy on. It was used to spy on back in 1 Samuel, and it's used in Genesis 42 when Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies, and it's used in Joshua when they were spying on the land. So it's translated as slandered here because it certainly doesn't seem to make sense that Mephibosheth is claiming that Ziba spied on him. But as Falkelman notes, the more literal meaning of to trip up poignantly elucidates what Ziba did to trip up a lame man, if that's the truth. And again, Falkelman falling for Mephibosheth's version and assuming that Ziba's a liar, but we have no basis for that. He slandered your servant to my lord the king. And notice the flattering language that Mephibosheth is using here, language that Ziba did not use in chapter 16 earlier when he came to David and told him what we saw here. And we can look back at that and see that Ziba just says flatly he remains in Jerusalem. And there's no sense of bowing before the king or speaking to him as my lord the king. He just speaks to him as if they're equals. But Mephibosheth is clearly deferring in the third person language of himself as servant and to my lord the king repeated twice in immediate sequence. And not only that, he adds this: my lord the king is like the angel of God, or the messenger of God. In this context, an angel is not what you might picture as a diaphanous thing with wings, but simply as somebody who's representing God, but looks like a person, as we see, for example, in Genesis 18, when the people are described as messengers of God, but Abraham and Sarah, I just think they're ordinary people, and there are other examples of that. But notice that this recalls what Achish, the Philistine leader, described about David as well at that time, and the wise woman of Tekoa in her story as well, referring to Joab as like the angel of God. Referring to David as well as the angel of God. All three of those. Her words are from Joab, but she uses that. So all this flattering of David, which leads to his conclusion, not what seems good to you, but what is good in your eyes. And we've noted that a number of times. For example, we saw it earlier here when Joab came to him and said, if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead today, then it would be right in your eyes. Back up there. But he continues. You'd think that would have been enough right there, but he continues. And this is certainly what leads David to say, you can stop multiplying your words. For he adds, for all my father's house were doomed to death before my lord the king. And no doubt about that. Literally, it means would have been men of death. Notice my lord the king 3 times in this short little speech here. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table, taking that like it's a compliment. At least it's not death, so it's a compliment in that sense. And then he adds in a phrase that's difficult to translate. Notice he has, what further right have I then to appeal to the king? And I've left it that way. But it could also be, what righteousness will I ever have, or do I have any more? In other words, it could be about, because tzedak could be about right in the sense of a legal right, but also in the sense of personal righteousness. So he could well be saying, I don't have any righteousness in myself, given that I was a Saulide and was doomed to death, to ask for anything more, or to cry out to the king, using the same language that Tamar did, which David did not respond to, and as David did in 19:5 over the death of Absalom. And so then, without any questioning, we see this. The king said, why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided, or more literally, I have spoken. You and Ziba shall divide the land. But let's note how some commentators see this. The late Walter Brueggemann, one of my great heroes and mentors, but he reads it as in a flash, David understands that he was previously conned by Ziba. And Brueggemann is certainly right that that's how David is interpreting it. But is that true? We don't know. Halpern adds, the Solomonic verdict represents a correction by the, quote, angel of God of an earlier failure to see through the question of loyalties. But is it? And Halpern, who's one of the sharpest readers and questioners of David of any scholar I've read, really seems to take it like Mephibosheth's version is the truth and Ziba's is not, even though we have no basis for knowing that. Falkelman suggests it's more complex, and he says, this is not a direct quote from him, but summarizing, he says, David has again fallen into the trap of his own haste. His solution makes us feel sad because he wants to reconcile the irreconcilable. David tries to weigh Mephibosheth's immaterial loyalty against the important material support of Ziba, which we saw earlier. This decision is ultimately embarrassing and painful to Mephibosheth and to any onlooker who is not morally insensitive or callous, for this decision puts the deceiver Ziba on a par with the incorruptible and dignified Mephibosheth. David has not really got out of his predicament. His bluntness in verse 30, B to D, is just putting on a very brave show. Underneath what lies fear of admitting his failings and showing his uncertainty, not to mention such vulnerable aspects as tenderness and the warmth of renewed chesed. Wow, that's a long statement for Falkelman, who is certainly the closest reader of any reader in English that I know, with his 4 volumes and over 4,000 pages of commentary on the books of Samuel. And yet, notice how he characterizes Mephibosheth as incorruptible and dignified, and any onlooker who would see otherwise as morally insensitive or callous. In other words, he's simply fallen for the same version that David has, but it doesn't have to be read that way. So his answer is, you and Ziba shall divide the land. And Mephibosheth says, let him take it all, since my lord the king has arrived home in Shalom. We don't hear any response from David to that, and we get on to an immediate other scene. But let's consider it for a moment. If David thinks that Ziba was conning him and that Mephibosheth is speaking the truth, why reward Ziba at all? But what good is land for Mephibosheth, given that he's lame, and given that he's being fed at the king's table? It's not like he needs to produce his own income. If the story that Mephibosheth is saying is true and Ziba is deceiving him, why not put Ziba to death and get Mephibosheth another servant for the land that would take care of the land, if that's the concern? But Mephibosheth must have already decided, I don't need the land. I just need to have the king believe that I wasn't part of the rebellion, and that when Absalom was dead, I wasn't licking my chops expecting the Israelites would put me back in the place as king. Maybe that's precisely what he was thinking, but at this point he realizes it's impossible. But we know nothing about that. And the fact that we don't know how he got there, or whether he's riding on a horse or a donkey, makes it really suspicious. But the story leaves it wide wide open there, and we just have to decide whether we trust his version or whether we see that David has once again fallen for a story that would have been better off subject to investigation. Next time we'll see another kind of story like this, but with a friend where the stakes aren't quite as high. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.